Crispy on the outside, but airy on the inside. This baguette recipe is shockingly simple and requires only 4 ingredients. It can be made in a matter of hours and it's absolutely delicious. Let's get started by taking out the ingredients. We need flour, of course, active dry yeast, a coarse salt, and the last ingredient is just water. I'm putting 4 heaping cups of flour in the bowl. When it comes to measurements for this recipe, or for most dough recipes, it's more important to look at the texture of the dough once you've mixed it, rather than to be super accurate and specific with the actual measurements of the flour and water ratio. And that's why, as you see, I don't use measuring spoons to measure out each ingredient, but rather I tend to just eye it. But again, I've made this recipe so many times. Don't worry though, if you look in the description below, I give accurate measurements. To the flour, I added a tablespoon of active dry yeast and a tablespoon of coarse salt. I will now mix these dry ingredients together. The whole process to make these baguettes will take about 4 hours minimum. I could speed up the process if I activated the yeast at the beginning, but I had most of the day to wait to let this rise, so I figured let me skip that step and make it easier on myself. Here I'm adding water. I have about 2 cups here, and I will add it slowly. I will continue mixing as I add the water to make sure that I don't add too much water, but I also don't want to add too little water. It's a balance between the amount of flour and amount of water. At first, I add about a cup of water to just the center of the bowl to start to moisten the flour. And I add about half a cup again once I've mixed it. Then for the last half a cup, I will slowly add it to the side of the bowl where I see that there's flour that is still dry and has not been mixed in. This allows me to easily get that last bit of flour at the bottom of the bowl incorporated. Here I'm showing you the consistency of the dough after mixing, and my fingers are a bit wet, so that's why it's not sticking to them, but if they were dry, it would certainly stick. That was probably the most labor-intensive part of the recipe. Now we put a cover on it and we wait. The warmer your house is, the less time it'll take for the dough to rise. I tend to put it by my stove. Naturally, that just tends to be a warmer place in my house because I use the oven and stove often. I swear I clean my kitchen 10 times a day, but I guess that's just life with 4 kids. Once the dough is risen, the next step is to shape it. Prepare yourself a sheet pan with parchment paper. Shaping dough does not need to be difficult or super intricate. You could put a fancy pattern on it, but honestly, who has time for that? Make sure you put a generous amount of flour down on a work surface. Here, I'm just getting the dough to release from the bowl, so I'm slowly going to move my fingers around. You can see that I'm putting flour on my fingertips so that the dough doesn't completely stick to them. I'm going to work my way around the bowl, pulling the dough from the edges into the center. This will tighten it a bit so that it's easier to work with. And then slowly I'm going to have it make its way out of the bowl and plop down onto the counter on top of the floured area. Once I've achieved this first step, it is time to shape the 2 baguettes. I will coat the top with some flour just to make sure it's not too sticky, and then use a dough cutter to separate the dough in half. I just eye it. I don't measure anything. And you don't need to use a dough cutter. I've used my hands to separate it. I've used a knife. Really, anything will do. And like I said, it doesn't have to be perfect. I'm going to sort of stretch out the dough a little bit in somewhat of a baguette shape. And then I'll go from side to side, back and forth, taking the dough from the outside and stretching it into the center. So I'm doing it a little slow here. I normally do it a lot quicker. But just so you can see the process, we just kind of go down the whole baguette and then take the sides and bring them into the center. This will be our bottom seam. So you have to make sure when you put it onto the actual parchment paper that that is underneath, so the air doesn't try to explode out of that bottom portion. I'll do a second one here. I'll change the angle a little bit so that you can see it a bit better, potentially. But it's a fairly simple process, and the more you work with dough, the more comfortable you will get, and the more confident you'll get to try new things, because honestly, there's so many delicious things we can make with such simple ingredients. I remember I used to love going to the grocery store when the baguettes were fresh and hot and had just come out of the oven and taking a nice bite out of them. And when I first made a baguette at home, I couldn't believe how simple it was to achieve such a delicious product that I really thought I could only purchase before. I really hope I can inspire more people to give bread making a try, because there's nothing quite as satisfying and delicious as homemade bread. I try to convince my family and friends too to try it out, but I have little success there. Maybe this YouTube channel will give them the last push they need. Once you've shaped your baguettes, you can put them on the parchment paper and they are ready to go into the oven soon. I usually start preheating my oven about now while I let these proof on the counter. Here's a good tip for you. Take that extra flour that was left on the counter and put it in your bowl to scrape off any leftover dough. I can tell you for a fact that dough is a huge drain clogger, so you do not want to be putting this down your sink. It will dry and become super hard and eventually will clog it, as my husband is aware of. Just a perk that comes with being married to a wife who loves bread making. I'm going to cover the baguettes with a towel so they don't dry out. And after they've proofed, which takes about 10 to 15 minutes, it's not too long, you need to cut a seam so that way the air has somewhere to escape. I don't do anything fancy. I grab my kitchen scissors and I just cut along one side. I do this because I'm using this bread to make sandwiches, so I actually cut open my baguettes right there where the seam is because it already is an area that lacks strength. But you could score it on top if you'd like, or do a fancy pattern. It really is your choice. I put it in the oven now, and here's one of the most important steps is you need to provide some sort of steam so that it doesn't get too hard. So I'm going to be spraying it every 5 minutes with water and rotating it. This is probably the most tedious process, but honestly it's super simple, and if you ever have someone else around in the kitchen, they can do a quick spray and rotate it. It doesn't require any skill at all. So here I'm spraying it and rotating it again. And I put a timer, and I will do it again. I actually have 2 spray bottles in my kitchen. One of them has just water, and the other one has water and vinegar that I use for cleaning. And you'd be surprised how many times I mix them up and I end up spraying my bread with vinegar water. But it doesn't actually matter. It still turns out great. I removed it from the oven after about 20 minutes when it looks nice and golden brown. Now, I don't like my bread to be too hard. It becomes more difficult for my kids to eat. I have a 2-year-old, 3-year-old, and 5-year-old who don't particularly like very chewy or hard crust. So I spray it with a towel and I'll let it rest and it'll soften up the crust a bit. But as you can hear, it still has a nice crunch to it. Please give this recipe a try yourself and let me know how it goes. This bread is so versatile. We use it for bread and cheese. We use it for sandwiches. We use it to dip in stew. Sometimes I cut it thin and put some tomato bruschetta on it. And you could also add things into it. I often get requests to make olive bread or jalapeno cheddar bread. If you enjoyed this tutorial, make sure to like and subscribe to my channel. It is my goal to simplify recipes so more people cook and bake at home. Enjoy!